I was a nurse at this hospital and only been working there for a couple of months. I had brought a patient of mine up to the day surgery from the ER for an endoscopy, and they called back down and asked me to bring her family up because she only spoke Italian and they needed someone to consent for the procedure. After dropping them off, I walked past the waiting room to head back down the hall to the elevators. I took the back way to get to the ER, and the hallways there are all deserted. It used to be a pediatric wing of the hospital, but that is all shut down for years now, and the rooms are just empty and full of broken equipment and beds. As I reached the old nurses' station at the T-junction between the pediatric hallway and the hallway that goes to the elevators, I saw a girl standing across the nurses' station further down the hall. She had big pigtails, was wearing a brown dress, white shoes, even holding a teddy bear. I thought perhaps she was a family member who had walked away from the day surgery waiting room. I was concerned that she would go into one of the rooms and get hurt or lost. So I said, "Hey, what are you doing? You don't need to be over there. You're going to get hurt." And I walked around the nursing station to go grab her hand and bring her back. I shit you not. She vanished as I go about 15 feet away from her. Every hair on my body stood up straight, and I turned and ran like a bat out of hell down to the elevator. I pounded the button for what seemed like forever until the elevator got to the floor. As I got back to the ER, I walked up to the nurse's desk, white as sheet. And one of the old nurses looked at me and said, "Jesus Christ, what's wrong with you?" I remember bubbling like an idiot as I tried to tell them what happened. After listening to me for a moment or two, the nurse said, "Oh, you saw the girl ghost. She's been around here for years." Apparently, the ghost has even been seen down in the ER, ducking in and out of patients' rooms and peeking around the curtains. My wife worked up on the 7th floor and she said that one time on nights, a whole row of patient rooms started yelling about the girl that was running around in the rooms. I guess she gets around. Have you heard of the Surge? This tale isn't a scary hospital story, but it's thought-provoking just the same. There was this nurse, let us call her M. M was an infirmary nurse, and one of her favorite patients was nearing her end. When the patient was still quite strong, she enjoyed being wheeled to the small enclosed garden in the hospital that was right beside the chapel. The old lady loved to tell happy stories of her youth, and the nurse obliged her by listening. That night, M was sitting down with her feeling that her patient's end was near. She was shocked when the patient suddenly sat up and asked for water. She went on to say she was hungry, and the staff was surprised by her sudden recovery. She gave her a light meal. The old lady asked for her favorite meals and she ate heartily. Later, she got up and they slowly made their way to their usual spot, where they sat quietly for some minutes, as M grappled with the impossibility of what was happening. Her patient suddenly turned to her and said, "M, I'm tired. I want to lie down now." M tucked her in, and the next morning, she was dead. The old nurses later shared that they had similar experiences in the past, wherein dying patients rallied right before they died.
I used to work at this trauma center in Texas on the 6th floor, and the hospital was old. I worked as a night shift floor tech at this hospital while I was going to nursing school. One night, there was this young lady on our floor dying of AIDS. She had contracted HIV through her boyfriend who had been using IV drugs. She was bleeding and was receiving countless blood transfusions, but she was losing the battle. At around 2 in the morning, I heard her yelling out for someone. Anyone. I went to her room and she said, "Whose kids are those?" She had been an alert and oriented patient, so I was concerned. I asked, "What kids?" The little kids with blue jean shorts. The blonde kids, she said. I informed her that it was 2 in the morning and that there were no children allowed on this floor at night. She appeared confused, staring at the empty space on the wall, and pointed out what she said was the children. She died a few hours later. After the incident with the blonde children and the young lady that died of AIDS, there was an older black lady on our floor who had been admitted earlier that shift with a possible seizure. I was her tech. She had been lucid, and about 2 in the morning, she hit the call light and I went to her room. She was crouching with her body in the fetal position, crying. I asked her what's wrong. She replied, "Get those kids out of here." "What kids?" I replied. "Those little blonde kids," she yelled. "I don't want them in my bed. They're trying to take me." I told her to calm down, that there were no children in her room. This didn't calm her. In fact, it only made her worse. She began screaming hysterically. "Oh my God, what do they want from me? Get them off my bed!" She was slapping at the empty air, screaming, "Don't you see them?" I told her no as she screamed even louder. While her nurse called the doctor, I finally convinced her that she would be okay if she just closed her eyes, which she did. She told me that she needed to pee and I offered her a bedpan, which she refused. She told me she had problems peeing in a bedpan, so I got her up to the bedside commode and stood beside her waiting for her to finish. She still had her eyes closed and she asked me to wait right outside the door and she would call me when she's finished, which I did. Her door was cracked so I could see and hear her in any case of a seizure. All of a sudden, she began seizing. I yelled for the nurse as I ran to her side. She was slumped on the bedside commode having a grand mal seizure. It took the entire floor to get her back to the bed as she was obese. She went into respiratory arrest, was coded, and died that night. That is when I started wondering about those blonde children and what they might be there for. I continued working at the trauma center in Texas as a nurse tech, and the nurses had heard rumors about the blonde children and had begun being kind of paranoid about it. It seemed like people that were dying or just plain sick were seeing children. Some of them described them as blonde and some just didn't want to describe them. They just wanted them to go away. There was a young trauma patient who had a gunshot wound to the abdomen and had gone septic. He was febrile and was delusional. However, he shared a commonality with other patients in that he described the blonde children in his room. On one occasion, the patient said, "The kids are so adorable. Whose are they?" When we asked what kids, he replied, "The cute little blonde boy and girl, right over there." He was pointing to an empty space in his room. He said their eyes were piercing him. He begged me not to leave him. I stayed with him for a while, talking about things that didn't make any sense, but it seemed to comfort him just having someone with him. I began thinking of the movie Children of the Corn. He said he had never seen the movie. He had to be transferred to the ICU that night and died a few days later. Nurses started refusing to take patients that's been reported to see these children. Everybody was scripted out. I left Texas and came to Orlando. I guess the children stayed behind.
Our next story happened to a nurse that involved another nurse rather than a patient. A department was assigned a new nurse that had slightly different vibe than the rest of the new nurses. She stood out for some strange reasons, and the others instinctively felt uncomfortable in her presence. One veteran nurse was particularly harsh to the new nurses. One time, she overheard the new nurse confided to another nurse how she could see things and had strange things happening to her. The veteran nurse gave her such a hard talking to in front of the others for spouting such nonsense that the new nurse ended up in tears. Forgetting about the incident, the veteran nurse walked into the nurse's sleeping quarters a few nights later, and there as clear as day, She saw the sleeping form of the new nurse and a second form of the same person sitting up and glaring at her. The veteran nurse backed away slowly and ran all the way to the nurse's station. Later, the new nurse admitted that her family frequently received stories about how she was sighted in different places that she didn't even frequent. I worked at a small privately owned nursing home. A lot of the patients had been there for a long time. One time, I was silly enough to take the night shift for 2 weeks right out of school to cover the night nurse who was ill. This place had these old hallway lights that you had to stick a paper clip in the slot on the wall to turn them on and off. There was one at each end of the main hallway. I carried the paper clip on my keyring. That night, I came in at 11. I took the report, set up supplies and whatnot. After that, I shut out the lights. The only light is from the lamp on my desk and the eerily red exit sign that casts this red wash all over the walls. Anyway, I'm standing at the med cart stocking up med cups and I feel a whoosh of air. It's winter and no windows are open. I heard a rustling sound and think that it's the resident in number 3, who is restless sometimes at night. His room is about 6 feet from the med cart. Now, being the brave nurse I am, I decided to check to make sure he's not trying to get out of bed. I go over to his room and find that he's sound asleep. I do a bed check, and everyone is sleeping and accounted for. The CNA is in the TV room doing flow sheets. I continue on with stocking. A little while later, I heard the noise again, and this time, I saw a figure out of my peripheral vision pass by me into room 3. This time, I'm not so brave. I took the CNA in with me, who now thinks I'm nuts. We went into the room and found the patient sitting up in bed having a conversation with someone who isn't in the room. When I asked him who is he talking to, he told me the man who is sitting in the chair in the corner. Obviously, no one's there. The aide and I settled him down and left the room. The next morning, I told the nurse about what happened. Before I could say who the patient was talking to, she said, "Let me guess, the man sitting in the chair in the corner, right?" Later, I had talked to the usual night nurse who said it happened all the time when she was on. More than one patient had the same experience. I never did get the name of the mysterious man in the corner, though. In any case, that is the end of my night shift stunt.
I had always heard ghost stories, but never had my own until I had been nursing for about 6 years. We had a bed tower in the hospital where I worked the night shift as a float nurse. It was a pretty quiet night at about 3 in the morning, and the nurses were sitting at the desk charting when my patient's light went off. His room was just right in front of the station, so I went in to check. When I entered his room, he asked me, "Is everything okay?" I replied, "What do you mean?" He said, "Someone just came in here. I woke up and someone was standing by my bed. They went out, but they didn't say anything." I didn't want to upset him, but I knew no one had been in there, so I just said, "Maybe it was the CNA, or maybe you dreamt about it." But honestly, I was secretly freaked out. Then, I came back to the nurse's station. I told the others what happened, and they weren't surprised at all. They said it happened all the time in that room, and the call light frequently went off when the room was unused. No one was sure who the ghost was, but had been seen many times. Sure enough, not a while later, I was working on the same floor, and in the early morning hours, the light went off. Same story, different patient.